I wanted to distract myself. I was like, I'm just running, I'm going, I'm going. If I do all these things, then I won't actually ever have to deal with it. When really, you eventually will break down and you can't keep going the way that you're going. And that is what happened when I was 19, when I was hospitalized, when I was taken to first, it was an urgent psychiatric center, and then they transported me to a hospital. Then I was court ordered treatment. I was terrified. It was the most scariest experience to be in that hospital, in those rooms. But
Today's guest is Paris Scobie. Paris is a beacon of hope and resilience in the mental health community. She's a mental health advocate, she's an author, she's also the host of Live Well Bipolar podcast. Her story is about overcoming stigma, embracing her own experiences, and really turning her personal pain into a platform for change. She opens up about her experiences with bipolar disorder and the path that led her to create her platform, Live Well Bipolar. Paris bravely shares her experience of being sexually assaulted at the age of 15. This event, deeply buried due to societal shame, really had a profound impact on her mental health. But today she speaks candidly about her struggles with body image, perfectionism, and ultimately her diagnosis of bipolar disorder. She's turned her trauma into a force of good, using her experiences to fuel her work in mental health advocacy. Through her podcast, she provides a platform for others to share their experiences, helping to normalize and destigmatize mental health discussions. Before we get into the episode, I want to thank my 2 episode a month supporters on Patreon. That's Mickey, Tracy, and Emily. Thank you for your support. If you are looking to directly support the show, please head to patreon.com/the Life Shift podcast, and you'll find all the information there. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to my friend, Paris Scobie. I'm Matt Gilhooly, and this is The Life Shift. Candid conversations about the pivotal moments that have changed lives forever. Hello, my friends. Welcome to the Life Shift podcast. I am here with a brand new connection, Paris. Hello.
hello, Matt. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. And we were supposed to do this last week, and I appreciate you. We had a little snafu with the internet line here. So, we just roll with the punches here.
That's what we do in this life.
And I was just going to say that too. Like, I feel like life is like a bunch of punches that sometimes we have to just go, okay, I can absorb that and I can move through. And your story today, I think, is a series of punches, but also things that you've adapted to. And I think what I have learned in the Life Shift podcast journey, this is like 120 something episode that I've had the opportunity to talk to other people that I didn't know beforehand. And I've just learned the resilience that we have as humans and the things that before they happen, we're like, I don't think I could survive that. Or we hear someone else's story and we're like, oh my gosh, that's so much worse than mine. But yet somehow we all kind of make it through. So it's just been so inspiring. And I know you're a podcaster and you've kind of felt the same way as well.
Yeah, we were just talking about that, right? Because I mean, we hopped on and you said happy anniversary because today is the 4-year anniversary of my podcast, Live Well Bipolar. And we were talking about this because I said I didn't realize starting this journey, like how healing and therapeutic this would be for me. I was thinking, okay, I'm opening this stage up for others to share their experiences that can help others. But really, I was doing the same all along. And I feel like that's something that we can really relate to too on this journey of just what it even means to me and why I even started this. Like, why did I start Live Well Bipolar? Where was I before it, and where am I because of it?
I tell people this a lot. The idea of the show comes from the fact that when I was 8, my mom was killed in an accident, and my life was 100% different the next day because my parents were divorced. They lived in separate states. Like, nothing was going to be the same for me. And growing up, I always felt like I was the only one to go through that experience. But by the time I made it to like my 40s, when I started this podcast, I was like, okay, he's healed. He's good. And then as I have more of these conversations, I'm like, oh, I didn't realize there were still parts of that 8-year-old boy that needed healing and needed to come along on this journey. So I feel the same. It's just such a nice little selfish blessing of having the ability to have these conversations and not only help the person telling the story, like you sharing your story is probably healing in its own way, but also for me and for the listeners, it's just like, who knew? Who knew that this could be such a healing space? You think of podcasts and you're like, huh, healing.
I love that connection that you make with it because especially when you bring up those pivotal moments of changes and the good and the bad, because we're always going to have that good and bad, but I feel like that's really what I try to look for is those moments of hope because I feel like no matter how much work I do, I still have days where I feel run down and hopeless. And I'm always looking for ways to continue to restore that. And I feel like these conversations do that. And they do it for me, they do it for you, they do it for the listeners. And it just really helps all of us see that whether it's, you say, your 8-year-old self or, whatever age we were when we experienced an event, tragedy, trauma, whatever it was, giving that our younger self those things that we're like, oh, I thought I healed from it, I thought I've been doing the work, but then there's still this thing that's coming up. So it's always going to be a continuous process, and I know you totally understand that.
Humanity, right? We're evolving beings, we have to, there are things that we're going to go up, down, and all around. And I think that I'm just, I'm so glad that we're here and you telling your story. I think I know a little bit about your story because we had a little bit of back and forth. And I admit to all the listeners that I don't do the research because I want these conversations to unfold. But what I do know of your story, I think is so important that you're sharing it and that you've created a platform where other people can share your story because I think, and I'm kind of like talking around it because I kind of want to, but in a sense, it feels like we're lessening the stigma that has existed for so long in some mental health diagnoses and medications and processes and all these things. And just like kudos to you for sharing your humanness with everyone in hopes of helping other people. So, in that sense, maybe you can tell us a little bit about who you are right now and what you do so that we can kind of jump into the story.
Yeah. So to answer that, so who I am right now. So currently, right now, I'm actually going to be celebrating my 1 year wedding anniversary in 4 weeks. Been with my husband 5 years now. And that is something that I will get into a little bit. Never thought that I would ever be able to have is a loving, healthy, fulfilling relationship because of my struggles I face mental health wise, a lot of things like that. But also, I have my podcast, Live Well Bipolar, that I started 4 years ago. And really, the whole reason I did this is to mainly to share my experiences because I still had a lot of self stigma that I needed to let go of to be able to be the person to show others your story and life has value. And from doing that, I actually ended up becoming something that I really never envisioned for myself. I really never thought there would be a place in my life for this thing, which is an author of my book, Crooked Illness, Lessons from Inside and Outside Hospital Walls. So it's pretty funny. I didn't know what to call my podcast when I started. I was in my parents' backyard. If you listen to the first episode, there's rocks crunching in the background. And I was like, wait, you need to name this thing before you release it. And I was like, okay, well, I'll call it Crooked Illness. And then that was the name of my story that I was writing on a Microsoft Word document, just trying to get it out there. And I feel like I have realized my value and the purpose for my life through getting uncomfortable and getting out of my box and starting the podcast. And from there, it's been this ripple effect of me saying, I'm done doing the same things I've always done because I'm clearly not happy. I'm clearly still struggling. There's many areas of my life that I'm trying to understand, but running away from it. So through starting the podcast, through sharing my story in my book, and also speaking professionally for NAMI, they are the National Alliance on Mental Illness. So I go out to different high schools, middle schools. They have different opportunities for me to come out and share my experiences. But this point in my life, I can honestly, confidently tell you, I am happy. I am fulfilled, and I am actually still dealing with something right now, health wise. I'm actually, the last couple of days, I've been feeling great, back to my normal self, but I had some stomach gut issues that have been going on for the past almost 2 months now that really took a big hit for me. about 3, 4, it was actually almost a month ago is when it really, really took a hit for me. But what I learned is I am able to navigate that just as I learned how to navigate living my life with bipolar disorder. When I first got my diagnosis, I didn't believe it. I was scared. I was ashamed. When I first started learning what was going on with my stomach, I felt the same exact way. And I said, you know what? I feel hopeless and a lot of struggle right now, but I've been able to do this thing. I can do this other thing too with support from people around me.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating, and congratulations on your book.
Thank you.
That's no small feat, and
Yes.
I think that when did you release it?
It was 2 years ago. Yeah.
Oh wow, that's awesome.
Thank
But
you.
I think again, back to this power of story and the things that it can do for us, and sometimes the stories that we tell ourselves are much scarier when they're in our head. And then when we put them out into the world, whether that's professionally speaking or writing your book or doing your podcast, you're like, oh, like I can conquer that or I can move through that. But when it's stuck up here and it's kind of going all over the place, it's very scary. And I think a lot of people can say that because society has put so much shame on certain things or like assigned us shame that we didn't assign ourselves, and we were just like, okay, I'll take it on and I'll move through the world with this. So good on you for all that. And I think you kind of snuck your pivotal moment in there a little bit, but maybe you could kind of give us, like, paint the picture of what your life was like leading up to what you feel really changed things for you.
Yeah, so you actually said it perfectly when you said stories are often scarier when we tell themselves to ourselves in our head than to the world, and we say it and we do it out loud and we're like, wow, it's not really what I thought it was or what I made it into be. So, to give you some background on me, so I am 28 years old right now. I was actually first diagnosed with depression when I was 16 years old, and then I was not diagnosed until I was 19 years old when I was hospitalized, put on court ordered treatment with bipolar 1 disorder. But I went through a sexual assault when I was 15 years old. And I feel like that is definitely something I internalized when you talk about the shame that society assigns us. I did. I believed that and I remember a part of this is because I had opened up to, friends in my school and some family and things like that. And what I got back was, well, look what you were wearing, you're a slut, like, you put yourself in this situation. And I really, at first, I was like, wow, I was upset, crying. It seemed really cruel. But I feel like you don't know any different when that's your whole environment. When you're in this environment where you're getting that same message, you really start to think that it must have been something I did. So, you know what? For me, I was like, I just need to minimize this. I need to tell myself it could have been way worse. I could have been killed. I really just ran away from it.
Push it down.
Yeah, I completely shut down. I would go out, party, drink, all that, the phase people often experience in their early teens, late teens, things like that. So that was my life from 15, 16, 17, 18, and then 19 was the hospitalization. And prior to my hospitalization, I actually brought it up I was seeing a therapist and then psychiatrist. And to give you some background, I used to think that I was misdiagnosed with depression, but actually I never had a manic episode until I was 19. So how are you supposed to diagnose someone with something that when it's not even it's not there, right? So, yeah, so I remember telling my psychiatrist when I was right before my hospitalization, I was saying, well, I think that I could potentially have bipolar disorder. I know this is genetic in my family, but I was like, I think this because of this. So I was like, I was working 2 jobs. I was a cashier. I worked in room service. I went to school full time. I got straight A's. I had a boyfriend who I fought with every single day, by the way, and friends, but I was drinking, partying. It wasn't meaningful relationships or connections, anything like that. So I remember saying this, and my psychiatrist was like, no, there's no way you have bipolar because of you're getting good grades, you're working, you're basically on paper, I looked great. so it's like, oh, well, what? And I was
You're
like, but
functioning.
yeah, I'm like, I'm not sleeping well. My thoughts are racing. Whenever you Google bipolar and you see, oh, grandiose thoughts racing, I was having that. I felt almost invincible in a way. And I was bringing this up and I just feel like I was never listened to. I was just told no, no. And I feel like I was like, you know what? What's the point anymore of trying to tell people how I feel when you're always told, look at how good you're doing? And it's like, but I'm not. And I feel like, what do I need to do to really have some change? And I wasn't even in the place where I was wanting to do the work or change. I just felt something wasn't right.
And no one was listening.
Yeah.
And you're like, this feels weird. Like I shouldn't be doing all this stuff. And here's what's happening. And everyone's like, well, no, you're fine. Just like when you had your assault as a couple years before that, is like people were too afraid to confront that with you. So they use their little masking of no, it must be everything is fine. You were just provoking it. Like talk about having the wrong people around you and not supporting what you need.
Right. And I always like to be really transparent too, is because of that, right? Like 15, 16, 17, 18, I struggle with it escalated to the point from at first being just negative thinking, then suicidal thoughts, then actually going through an attempt, a lot of struggles with my body image. So just not liking myself, the way I looked, any of that. So I was never actually diagnosed with any type of eating disorder, but I definitely would take things to the extreme with
Of course.
I
Yeah.
want to be, maybe if I stay a certain size, people will love me or like me or something. That's kind of my thinking was so warped at the time.
Was it more to get like that approval, or do you think it was more to avoid another assault? Because I've heard both, in sense of like people are like, I'm going to just say, I'm just not going to eat so that I don't have shape, so that therefore it won't be my fault, kind of thing. And curious.
I think so. That's a really good question. And I think for me, it was just approval and perfectionism on my part because I've always been this very. And I think with just like school, with home, with grades, like getting very good grades, like always being that kind of like achiever. I was an athlete, I was used to like putting on a good face. And I feel like for me, it wasn't so much, I think I had like stuffed the assault so far back that I was like, it wasn't real. And I would have these, I think for my way of coping with that it was, I thought it was a good way of moving forward, which was actually making it worse because I would go out and I would sleep with more people to the point where people were actually getting feelings for me and wanting a relationship. And I'm like, I don't want that. And I think it was because of, again, I never worked on the root of what happened with that assault that I was carrying it over.
Yeah. I mean, it sounds like you wanted to control it. Like, they can't do it to me if I'm doing it, or I'm allowing this, or I'm
Mhm.
moving through this. It's our minds are protecting ourselves. And I understand the overachievement too. I think that is a piece of like getting that acceptance. It's not even about like, oh, I'm smart and I can do these things. It's rather like I have to be as smart as possible so people don't dismiss me. Because I'm sure you were getting dismissed all the time in certain things. You're like, no, but I'm doing I'm
Right.
working 2 jobs. I'm getting good grades. I'm doing all
Exactly.
the things.
I think that's a really good point that you bring up because I feel like I wanted to distract myself. I was like, I'm just running, I'm going, I'm going. If I do all these things, then I won't actually ever have to deal with it. When really your body, your body keeps a score. There's a book, you eventually will break down and you can't keep going the way that you're going. And that is what happened when I was 19, when I was hospitalized, when I was taken to, first it was an urgent psychiatric center, and then they transported me to a hospital. Then I was court ordered treatment, all of this stuff. And I was terrified. It was the most scariest experience to be in that hospital, in those rooms. But I feel like after it happened and I came home, at first I was like, maybe I should change the people around me. But I feel like I went back to my old self, which was still like, again, oh, look at my, because you don't have your phone when you're in a psychiatric hospital. So I got my phone and I'm like, wow, look at all these messages from all these guys or all these people. They missed me, but it's like they don't really value you. They value the fact that you go out, you're wild, eccentric person to be around, and you're sleeping with them. They don't even want to take you on a date or actually get to know you. It's just, and I didn't even care. I really did not value myself. I just kept going, going, going. And I didn't realize how continuously that was damaging me when I finally did actually meet my husband 5 years ago. But that was when I was newly into doing the work. So that was 19 years old, to give you some context, the hospitalization. So then I came home from the hospitalization, 19, 20, 21, 22. So I had 4 years where I continued doing the same things. Let me just keep the same people around me, and it was also because I didn't have awareness into it. I just knew I wasn't happy, but I thought that was normal. I thought everyone lived like that.
A lot of people do. And I think that we kind of see that and we absorb that. But I think there's so much trauma that you went through that deep-seated thing. It's like this constant chase. If you keep going, you don't have to stop and think about it.
Mhm.
It's like I I understand the running, and then you sit and you're like, I can't be quiet. Like I did you have that moment when you were in the hospital where the quiet was really hard, or was it not quiet? I don't understand what that might be
Yes,
like.
that's a good question. So it was not quiet actually. And I didn't have, I feel like for me, that moment of quiet, and I think to understand your question, are you talking about that realization of just giving myself the opportunity to feel like I can, or what was it? Because I want to see.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious if someone, I mean, the way you describe your life leading up to that moment was very chaotic in a way. Like it was just very, 99% of the time you're doing something, and you're doing something to the point that when it's time to go to bed, you're just so tired that you go to bed. And then you wake up and you just do, do, do. So I was thinking, and I do this because we see lots of movies and they show us this picture of, like the white padded room where it's very quiet and nobody's paying attention to you, where
Right.
really it was probably just this noisy event where everyone's walking in every 10 minutes to not give you that silence. Because I think silence is scary for people. I've been in depression. I wouldn't say it was clinically depressed, but in those moments when you're sitting with just yourself and the quiet, it's really scary.
So now I totally understand what you're asking and hearing you break this down. So for me, that moment of silence looked like, which I haven't shared with you guys yet, but I actually went back and I worked at the same hospital where I was a patient at, where I got my bipolar diagnosis, where I was put on court order treatment. That for me, I had that moment of silence when I walked back in through those doors, and I was there to meet with, it's like, "Oh, you're here to pick someone up and, take them home, or, do their check-in on, the paperwork and all that stuff." So that for me, that was my moment of silence, walking through those doors and seeing the place where this is where I was for 2 weeks, and in my mind, that felt like a year, because you really lose track of time, and I definitely was in psychosis. So for people who don't know what that is, it's you literally are not living in reality. You're completely removed, and you're almost consumed with, it gets to the point where you're experiencing delusions that you full-heartedly believe this is fact. And I was literally experiencing that during the hospitalization. So for me, that moment of silence, walking through those doors, and really also still knowing in my heart that I still wasn't comfortable sharing my story or my experiences. I still wasn't comfortable fully doing the work, but I was starting it. I realized in that moment of silence, I'm in the right place, but I need to start doing more for myself so I can show up.
Yeah, because you probably saw in other people the slightly different version of you,
Mhm.
and like with a different awareness, because I think we don't see ourselves in the moment. While you were telling that, I just had a side question of like, do you think an environment like that enhances a psychosis?
Yes, and I'll say that. Well, it's, and other people who've been in psychiatric hospitals might have a different answer. Their setting might be different, their environment, but for me, my experience was not good or positive. I feel that way because I was put in a place where everyone is in crisis. Like I remember looking around me, and it was the person to my left just had been taken here after trying to commit suicide with rope burns on their neck. The person over here they just had their children removed from them for a child protective case. Everyone was in crisis, going through something, whether it was dealing with suicide, whether it was dealing with addiction, which often gets very mixed in with mental health, which I think does need a separate, obviously separate attention and treatment. But that's also a downfall of the system, is everything's thrown into one bucket. You're in crisis, you're in crisis, you're in crisis. And it does make it very hard for somebody who was willingly going in. I was not voluntary. I was involuntary. So there's involuntary hospitalization and there's voluntary for people who are like, I'm going to go here. And I think for me, it wasn't conducive to any kind of path forward because I was constantly feeling at risk. And I saw many, many other people that were in there with me fighting, getting attacked. I saw blood, shed, different things like this. And it was
It's
very
like a new trauma. You're like
exactly
adding trauma.
to that. Yeah, it was scary. And I literally remember saying this when I was in the hospital, asking one of the techs working there. And they were like, what do you think someone's going to do? Come and guard your door at night? Like, I don't know why you think we're like bodyguards. And I was just like, I am actually afraid because and I remember like, I outline everything in the book, like and I literally have in there's italicized versions in my book where it's literally giving the reader insight into how I used to speak to myself to show people this is how sick I really was. And I just remember seeing so much violence and fighting. And I'm like, how is anyone here supposed to be healing? Or you're just throwing medicine at people. You're not even, I remember they gave me medication and I couldn't walk straight. I couldn't open my hands. And I remember one day I refused it and I was taking other ones. And I remember I was in front of the judge when I was supposed to be going home. And the judge said, well, I know you refused medication before. You can't do that. And I literally was like, you know what? I will say whatever I need to say so I can go home. I will just, whatever you want me to agree to, I just need to leave because I would only get honestly like an hour or two a night sleep. I got no sleep in there. And I was actually to the point where when I did come home, I was in there for 2 weeks and I came home and it's almost the 10-year anniversary of my hospitalization. It'll be this December. But I came home and I would see figures that weren't like, I would see things, I would hear things that weren't there. And I think it was definitely due to like 2 weeks of not being able to sleep normal because it's just so backwards, right? Like we're going into this facility, we're going to evaluate you, we're going to give you a diagnosis, but what about the path forward? What about, and I asked that. I said that because a doctor was sitting there and she had like a checkboard and it was like, did you go to your groups today? Did you go to the bathroom? Like these, like just tiny little things. And I was like, and I feel like it's, unless you're homeless or going to a rehabilitation center, they're like, okay, well, you have a home to go to, you have somewhere to go release to. We're not going to even ask. And I'm like, aren't you going to ask me like if I'm in school, if I'm working? Like it was just nothing.
Yeah, it's very curious. I mean, it sounds very much like some of the movies kind of portray. It's like in your circumstance, you were in a space that maybe you needed help. Maybe they wanted to intervene and they thought, okay, this girl needs some intervention here. She needs some help. Clearly, something's going on. Okay, fine. I can get on board with that. But the situation you described doesn't sound safe at all. It just sounds like they've given you new traumas to now you also have to process those when you get, into a safe space again. But at the end of the day, that should be the safe space, right?
Mhm.
If the goal is to rehab, to rehabilitate, to help you find a new normal, help you, whatever that goal is, doesn't sound like they served you. It sounded like you said they just kind of give you some medications and hopefully that masks it enough that the check mark is made and you can carry on with your life.
Right. And see, that's exactly what I experienced when I went back and I worked there. I was like, I want to be able to tell the patients, the people that I'm like, look, I was in this hospital. I take the same medication as you. And I worked with people of all ages. So I was, there's people who were under 18, or maybe like around 18 to like 60, 70 is the oldest I've seen. But I was told not to do that. I still had a lot of trauma inside myself. It just called into a lot of question because I think back to when I was released from the hospital and I was put on court order treatment for a year. I had to go get my blood drawn like every month. They check your levels, make sure you're taking your medicine. And I had a case manager and I think about her and I think about, wow, what if she told me that she also has a bipolar diagnosis and this is what she does. I feel like that would have helped me. But, and it's also sad, also working in that industry, I did see a lot of things that really just disturbed me from there's a lot of people working in that industry who shouldn't be working there because I remember some of the staff would be like, "Oh, when you go out to do home visits, do not accept any of if they try to give you water or drinks." I'm like, "Are they so you're trying to say that they're trying to poison me?" Like I just think you assume like anyone with a mental illness or cuz I was diagnosed so it's SMI, which is severely mentally ill. It's a classification so of a mental illness diagnosis and they say anyone with SMI. So there was people who when you get out sent out to a clinic either you've been hospitalized or whatever your diagnosis is but they would treat people different who were SMI like oh like they're the dangerous ones, right? And I'm like I literally have had that diagnosis and I just feel like it literally made me realize so much that was wrong and that's really when I mean, I even went back to school. I got my master's in healthcare administration to learn more of just like business outcomes. And I wanted to learn like what do these organizations actually do? Because clearly I don't really
You didn't experience it.
I didn't see any of it. So yeah, it was just a lot of letdowns. But I feel like what I've been able to achieve is finally breaking free from my thoughts in my head that if I tell someone that I have a bipolar diagnosis, they're going to think I'm crazy, all these things, right? And I feel like now I'm in such a place where I no longer take things personal. If I do come across somebody, I also need to realize I do not know their story. I don't know if they've had a family member, someone close to them who they've lost who has a bipolar diagnosis and it might be triggering for them to see someone like me who's so open who's able to talk about this thing so I also and it just depends on the situation but I feel like I realize now the value in my story and I think about the people I'm hurting by not telling it.
For sure. Well, also, like, I think we need to get to a place where any diagnosis is a diagnosis and it is what it is. If I got diagnosed with a broken finger, no one's going to think I'm crazy, right? Like, I
Mhm.
feel like it's, it's just something. And I talked to someone else that was on NAMI or is part of NAMI, Alessandra Torresani. Do you know? I don't know if you know of
Yes.
her. So, she was saying the same thing. It's like, it's just part of me and this is just how I operate in the world and now I found a way that works for me so that I can be a productive citizen in the way that I want to be. That is my life. I can choose the way that I want to do it. I'm not hurting other people by doing it.
Mhm.
So I think you should be telling your story. Is there a part of your story where you feel like there was something that happened in which you were like, I'm in a new place. I'm in a new space. Like I feel like a different Paris. I feel like Paris, France and not Paris, Texas. Like
I love that. That's amazing. I think for me, it was that moment. So it was actually when I had some friends reach out who I went to high school with, and they said, "Hey, we're actually helping put together this conference for someone that we work with." And I was like, "I don't know. Why are you?" And then they were like, "Oh, it's this Think and Grow Rich conference. It's like personal development." And I was like, "I don't even know what personal development is. I don't know what Think and Grow Rich is. I don't know." But I was like, "I will, yes, I'll go if you want me to go." So I remember going to this conference and it was the very first time I've ever been to an event where I've seen speakers get up on stage and actually talk about things that are real. Like I went through homelessness, drug addiction, like losing people I love to suicide. And they told real stories that were so impactful. But also at the same time, it made me uncomfortable in the way that at that time, I was like, I don't ever think I can get up on a stage and do that and do what they're doing. And it was that first moment that seed was planted for me of changing my environment, changing my and breaking down what does that even mean, right? Giving myself awareness and saying, are the relationships I have around me serving me? What am I doing with my time? What are my habits? I literally said, that's when I got back into the things that I used to do that I loved, which are working out, reading. I started listening to podcasts. And I remember that conference was where that seed was planted for me of the possibility of seeing other people do things coming out of this trauma because I was so used to being around people who haven't done it and were so hopeless and drained and exhausted that I didn't know anything else. So I was like, wow, maybe I can just look into this a little bit more.
Yeah. So it was like a trigger. It was like, oh, a little interest, a little nugget of interest. Do you look back at those high school friends and that experience of them reaching out to you as maybe like one of a few moments and people really saw you and saw that you were changing and maybe it was in this small way that you weren't noticing, but do you ever think of that?
Yeah, that's a beautiful realization that I actually never thought of that way. And I think that that makes a lot of sense because, yeah, that's when we're so close to our lives and our story, we can't see it, but other people can see the differences. And I really actually, I remember going to that and talking with them and just thinking, like, why did they ask me to come to this? Right. And I feel like it's because I've gotten to a place where I'm starting to learn about these things. And then from there, actually, that's actually right. It was right after, or right, I have to look at the timeline, either right after or right before I met my husband for the first time. And that is when, again, because I've never had healthy relationships either. It was always toxic, abusive, controlling, that I was the one who would try to like start problems in the relationship because I was so used to that I didn't know it was healthy, was foreign to me. Healthy communication, and I thought that I had to work to earn love. I was told that, I was treated that way, and I think a lot of that also stems down to another part of my story that I don't often really get into, but being exposed again and abused from a sex work standpoint that I had also in other men that I was with or whatever the situation was. But again, being exposed to an industry like that and thinking that, again, I don't value myself. I don't see my life as worth anything. So if I'm being told by these people around me that I can do these things and make money and get paid for it, then I might as well do what they're telling me. So again, it's all rooted in the trauma. It's all rooted for me in the sexual abuse that I just didn't think I could move past it. I
Yeah.
didn't even give myself a chance with that. So I feel like if you aren't even giving yourself the awareness into it, you can very easily fall victim to certain things like this. So I think that was a big trigger.
You create patterns. I think you create patterns. And I can relate to, the experience of like losing my mom at such a young age. I think, I push it down. I didn't have people around me that really knew how to help. It was like, make him happy. He'll be fine. And so then I absorbed that everyone wanted to see me happy. So I just had to perform and be overachiever and do all these things. And it's the same kind of parallel to what you're talking about is that like in my 30s, I finally went to like a therapist, and she was like, after lots of talking, she was like, you realize that every single decision that you've made since you were 8 years old was with that 8 year old's scared, lost his mom brain. Like everything started unraveling. And I was like, you're right. Everything I chose to do was because of that 8 year old being really scared of the outcome of that decision. And I think there's so much to be said of this pushing down a sexual assault and the people around you that just had really shitty responses to you. Like that probably still affects some of the decisions you make, even if you've made all these, this progress. And there's something to be said to people listening that if you have something like that, if there's a possibility for you to start to unpack it, there's so much value in the growth that can come from it. It's scary. It's not easy, but
Right.
a lot of our patterns are because of these things that we thought were something we packed away and is fine back there. So
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to put it because I feel like when I think back to my younger self going through that assault and then also like after, I mean, when I opened up to people about it, I remember like walking through the hallways in high school and hearing, oh, she's a slut, or it's spread around and people were thinking, and that's why I think it's so sad is I feel like for me to understand like losing people to suicide and these behaviors that people can exhibit. I mean, I've struggled with self harm. I've struggled with isolating. I've struggled with shutting down. I've struggled with being very mean and cruel to the people around me that I love because in my mind, I was like, if I'm mean and I push them away, then when I'm finally not here anymore, they're going to look back and say, well, she wasn't a nice person. And that's so wrong. It's so wrong because sometimes when you've been so clouded and stacked on top of different traumas, we just believe these things and we think, if I were to not be here anymore, people aren't really going to care. They're not going to miss me because I was mean to them. And really, and you don't know, you don't fully, but I feel like you sometimes aren't thinking, and that's, at least for me, wasn't thinking in the right mind. But I think that for me, that was really the most powerful moment of just starting to tell my story and like learn about, and that also another moment that I can share with you. I remember when I first started my podcast, I would send it to everybody. I was like shooting it to like all my friends. And I remember someone that I thought was a friend was like, "Hey, stop sending me this. I don't listen to podcasts. Like, I don't even like," was like really mean. And I was just like, I had a lot of that from people and that was because, and it started to show me, it was a blessing in disguise to show me these people are not really my friends. These people, and I had a lot of people around me who would only check on me to see, "Oh, wow, you moved into a new apartment. Like, what are you doing? Or what are you up to?" And it was never, "How are you?" Or, "I want to check on you." It was, and I feel like starting the podcast showed me that, because I was like, you know what? If these people aren't going to care, and they're going to call me lame because I'm not drinking as much as I used to, I'm not going out and partying all the time, then I can find my people, and I can find the people who have made changes, and I'm going to start seeing what they did, and I'm going to bring it to other people, because I wish I had that when I was younger.
Yeah. It's an interesting experience when you start healing and you start healing yourself and you start to feel different. The things that you notice in the people around you that haven't started their healing, and you
Mhm.
realize that they're not there yet. I wasn't there for X amount of time, and I need to put myself in a new space. And now you're going to find people that maybe are farther down the road of their healing journey. And then, you kind of like move through that. It's such an interesting thing that if you don't stop to look and see what you're doing, you're like, how did I get here? Like, how did I become this version of me when just X amount of years ago I was like a hot mess? And I'm like, how did I become comfortable enough to ask people about whatever circumstance? And it's like, oh, well, I guess I kind of did the work, because before I did the work, I think we shy away from it. And so every time you tell these stories, and I hate that I have this compassion in me, but every time you tell these stories about these assholes in your life and the people around you that just like sucked at life and weren't supportive of you, I almost feel bad for them, because they haven't worked through whatever caused them to be like that to you. I don't know if you ever relate to that.
When you say that, it literally reminded me of, I don't know if it was something I learned in therapy, but it was, people can only meet you as far as they've done the work themselves. So I realized that, because when I would do like when I think back to my younger self, if myself now was trying to talk to Paris, who was 10 years ago, and I was like, "Hey, like, you know, telling her, like, in 10 years from now, you're not going to enjoy going out and blacking out. And, you're going to have a loving husband. You're going to have an amazing home together. You're going to have a beautiful wedding, honeymoon, like all the things that you told yourself you couldn't have because of this." And I feel like that's the thing, is telling your younger self those things. And I think for me, that's really the key, is just realizing that so much of what I was focusing on, I was so focused on what I could not control rather than what I could control. Like I said, you know what can I do, right? I can okay, I can start working out, going on walks, going to the gym. I can start changing my diet. I can try to get my sleep on track. I can, and also I learned how to set boundaries. I learned how to respect, those people in my life now who are my friends and who are, have the same interests that I have. And even with my husband, like, he's taught me so much about myself, because he actually would call me out on the shit that I was starting to work on coming to this relationship. But I had a lot of habits that I still needed to work on. And he would help me and support me. And it wasn't like coming from a place of threatening, or because I've definitely had partners where I opened up about living with bipolar, and they were like, "Oh," and they used it against me. They were like, "I'm going to tell my family that you have bipolar." And it was just very bad. So I feel like I learned a lot. And I'm about to be 29 in April. So my last year in my 20s. So I feel like I've learned, I feel like I'm honestly,
It gets better.
I feel like, yes, I feel like I'm such an old soul inside. Like, I really
You've lived a lot of lives.
right. And I
You
think that
have.
it just comes down to, for me, I mean, even now, like this past month, well, January was a really bad month for me with my everything I was struggling with my stomach, and I had a lot of tests done. I've had like 7 doctor's appointments in the last like 6 7 weeks. I'm thankful that nothing serious was found. I wasn't, ruled to have celiac, Crohn's, any kind of colon cancer, anything like that. The only thing they found was inflammation in my stomach lining, which I think I've actually haven't had any issues in the past 2 days. So I think that that's something you can heal through your diet, paying attention to this connection. But I feel like, again, it goes back to the point that I made earlier, is we're no matter how much work I've done on myself, like I've done consistent, this is 5 years now of consistently doing the work for my mental health. You're always going to learn new tools. You're always going to have old, and I mean, even last year or something, like, yeah, I had the trauma resurface from going through the sexual assault that I didn't think would, because I spent years in therapy, and I had an incident happen like where I was just reminded, and I was like, why am I crying and I can't eat, and it's impacting my whole days. And I feel like, again, it was because I realized how much I still would downplay what I went through. And it was a good opportunity for me to go back to, continue therapy, work on that stuff. But I think it just goes back to, we're always going to be evolving. We're always going to have, but I think it's important to give yourself grace and also celebrate where you are, right? Even if you're not where you want to be and you're like, what do you mean celebrate myself? My life sucks. Well, I'm pretty sure there's at least one thing in your life that has gotten you to where you are and that you can give some gratitude to. And I always try to do that, even when I've spent the last month going through all of that. I try to do that.
I think it's important. I think it's awareness is just like such a big piece that sounds so like nebulous and sounds like, "Ooh, what does that mean?" But, in the sense of like that seed being planted in that conference that you went to, and people are like, really? You saw someone on stage, but you saw you in a different version. You saw
Mhm.
someone up there that was doing the things that subconsciously you wanted to do. You needed to heal. You wanted to share your story because you realize like these people are sharing their story and they look healed. Like there's this connection that we see and they're like, oh wait, I can do this.
Mhm.
I can, become a person like that. Like my story doesn't sound so bad compared to theirs, or mine sounds a little worse, or whatever it might be. But this awareness component is so important. And I think it kind of opens our eyes to things and we're like, oh, like we said before, like when you have the story and you put it out in your head, it's much worse. It's like,
Right.
and then you say it and you're like, why did I stress for 6 months over that when I could have just said it out loud or put it on paper and then be like, oh, I could do that. Done. So I think there's this awareness piece. Do you really look at that, like that conference moment as like kind of that first step on the staircase?
Yeah, so that was the first, just I mean, prior to that, I don't remember too much of what I was starting, but it was literally that conference where I saw that and I started to do the work, and that's what actually ended up me starting the podcast, and then realizing, I want to share more about my journey. I want to bring on more resources. And I did have, a lot of people that I thought were my friends. I've been able to now be in a place where I don't have any people around me at all who I have questions about. Back in the day, everyone around me I had questions about, but I was scared to say anything. I was scared. And I mean, even recently, it was like, I mean, it was last year. I had someone, a good one of my other friends from like a while ago, but who was going through some things that was hard. And I feel like it's also knowing when to set the boundary, right? And to if someone is, you know, being unkind to you or treating you in a way that is not what you're deserving, it's okay to let them know that. The old me wouldn't do that. I would just take whatever anyone says. But I feel like I went through a situation where I had to end friendships, and I said, this isn't, I don't think this is right to me. And I'm going to share how I feel. And you can still separate, but I think it's not putting up with that. If you have a friend who is, treating you badly, or, not supporting, decisions that you are doing to put your mental health first, you don't need to be around those people. And I feel like it can be scary, right? I mean, for me, it was it when I was, but now I have no problem if I have anything like that anymore, because I know it's going to do more damage to me than good.
Yeah, you have self-love. You care for yourself and you want to make sure that you maintain that, and I think it's important. I think, growing up, a lot of us were told, like, the more friends you have, the better you are, right? Like, the more qualified you are as a person because you have x amount of friends. But really, it's about what serves you and what makes you happy, and I'm glad you're in this space because I think there's a version of your life that could have gone a lot differently.
Right. And I think that that's yeah, like you said, like just looking back on things now, like I look at all my relationships from 10 years ago. And I mean, there was friends that I had since high school. And when I started to change and I started to say, I'm not going to go out and drink every weekend. I don't want to do that. I don't want to. And now I basically don't even drink anymore at all. But I feel like it just, and also I think, again, it's important. Like I'm not someone who's ever struggled with alcohol, like to the point of, it's severely impacting my life, but I don't like who I am when I feel like, oh, I need to go out and, people are pressuring me to drink and it's a cool thing to do. I don't feel that anymore. And I feel like I had a lot of friends who, and they were not the same, like you said, like not healed, and they were going through their own traumas. And I was trying to help them and being like, hey, they've had abusive boyfriends and they're still in these relationships. And this was from a long time ago, but you can't do the work for people. You can't. And if they're not willing to do that and it's, bleeding over into you and it's hurting you, and, they're called, like, I remember being called lame or I'm not fun because I'm not fun. Why? Because I don't go blackout drunk and go sleep with everybody in front of you. Like, it's just, that was not normal behavior. And, I've worked very hard to have a relationship, the marriage that I have now, because I really didn't think I could even be married or have a relationship, because I I was told that, and I was told I wouldn't have that, and I was scared because of my bipolar diagnosis. I didn't know if someone was going to want to have a future with me. So all these things that I told myself, I mean, I told myself I couldn't public speak. I can't, I do that now. So it's like, I'm like, I can't do it. I'm too scared. But I was the one stopping myself because of my environment. And again, when you're able to see that, the first step is seeing it. You need to be able to see it. You
It's
need,
awareness.
right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I think it's fascinating. I have a side question. Are you still in touch with those high school friends that recommended that conference?
So I actually, it's so funny because I would be if I could, because they only had like a Twitter account, but they like I probably still, I actually might have their numbers, but I just haven't talked to them in a while. We would talk like a couple times throughout the year and stuff like that.
I feel like you need an episode on your show where you can talk to them about that moment. And if they saw
Yes.
something, I think it'd be so fascinating
Right.
because, what if they hadn't? What if they hadn't called you up and been like, here's this conference information, and they hadn't, done that, and you didn't take that step to go see these people that like had redemption stories, if you will, from their own experiences that they've gone through, and then that light wasn't lit up in you, and like all these things, these trickle. It's so fascinating how someone just seeing us for who we are and what we're doing and seeing the value that we're putting into the world and just telling us, or an action like that can change your whole life. Like, it always fascinates me to like find these little moments of like a love that kind of just like wasn't this overt experience of love. It was just like someone saw you.
Hmm.
They saw you and they were like, you're doing the work. Maybe you should go to this thing, like open the door for you.
I love that. And that's a great idea, because I remember I give them a shout out in my book, and I told them, we were talking about even, yeah, like 2 years ago, a couple years ago, but I feel like that, and I think a part of it was because I lost, like, I actually I lost my Facebook, I lost my Instagram, I lost everything. And I was like, oh, I don't even have
It's kind of
Facebook.
a blessing.
Yeah. And I think honestly, you know what? It probably is because I also was rebranding the podcast anyway. And another thing that I want to give you guys a message on is start before you're ready. So I started the podcast. I didn't even have a name. I just named it my book, which wasn't even my book yet. So I called it Crooked Illness. Then I changed it to Master Your Mental. And now it's Live Well Bipolar. So I feel like a lot of people have this thing in them where I can't start a podcast or I can't do anything because it has to be perfect. You will literally go through changes, whatever, rebrands, and you don't need to be that way. And I feel like I used to be like, oh, oh wow, I'm look at me, I'm not, I didn't do it right from the jump. But your people will always be your people no matter what you're doing. If you're speaking the messages they need, then that's all that matters. And I feel like that's something too, is start before you're ready, right? Start with boundaries, start with your relationships, with your habits, with getting the awareness. You don't need all the pieces to know what you need to move forward.
It's like anything. You're not great the first time you do anything. Like in most cases, whether that's your first time going to therapy, you're not great at sharing your story because you're close, and then the next time you go, you get better. Or the first time you do your podcast, it's like, oh, I won't go back and listen to that. But the second one, you're like, okay, it's a little bit better. And you kind of go through the thing. And I think it's such a great message to like just start. If you have this, say we bring it back to like you're facing depression or you're facing a bipolar diagnosis, and you kind of have this little awakening, this little light of like, maybe there are some things that I can kind of move through. I'm not going to quote unquote fix it. Like I'm not going to do one thing and then all of a sudden everything's perfect and like we can run down the yellow brick road. But, like one little thing. And then it just kind of, it snowballs, like things just get bigger and you get better and you feel different. And then you look back and you're like, how'd I get here?
Yeah, I think that that's exactly like it is, like that snowball effect of, and then seeing it, looking back on it and being like, "Oh wow, this is," and I feel like I'm doing that today because it's the 4-year anniversary of the podcast, and I feel like without the, like, if I think about it from this standpoint, if I never started the podcast, I would have never shared my story in my book. I would have never found, like, been speaking for NAMI, because NAMI found me through, it's actually a funny story how they found me through a news story that they did on me through a friend who now is like my best friend and maid of honor. Like, we're like, it's just this whole thing. But it's the ripple effect of when you start one thing, it leads to another. And like, I feel like for me, it's just the messages and the feedback from people, the emails of, I found you from wherever. And whether it's the podcast, my book, you saw me speak, I don't know what it is, but being able to see people of all ages from all over the place say, you, like, I had this amazing person reach out to me and he's like, I'm 60 years old and you're my hero. And he wrote me this long email and I'm sitting there reading
That's
that.
beautiful.
And I feel like sometimes I have moments where I'm just like, like when you're having a bad day, like, should I just stop doing this? Like, it's been 4 years, like, whatever. And I feel like it's that shows me that I helped you feel like you can open up about your diagnosis. I helped you feel, and like, there's people who've come to me and said, I launched a podcast because of you. I started my podcast. So it's like, and again, like, I start to think about who are my people, right? Who are my people who got me to be where I am? So it's just so cool to see that.
I love a ripple effect, and we don't realize it until we stop and we look back and we see all the things that we've done. It's so fascinating. And your story, I mean, thank you for sharing it. I love to kind of wrap these up with a question, and I'm wondering if you could go back to the Paris that just got out of the hospital and she's kind of getting back into the same routine. Knowing what you know now, is there anything that you would want to do, say anything with her?
Yeah. So I would want to say that you don't need to feel like you need to stay where you are and tolerate the things that you've tolerated in terms of the abuse from these relationships. And really just say that, you will be in a place that you never thought you would. You will find love, happiness, fulfillment. You're on that path. It's going to still be hard, it's going to still be challenging. But I want you to know that your life does have value, your story does have value. And you are going to see that. And I'm going to continuously show up every day for you so you can see that along the way.
And you did. Maybe you heard it. Maybe you just had to go through a couple speed bumps and then hit those speed bumps, show up to that conference, meet your now husband, and life kind of unfolds in the way it does. So thank you for sharing that. If people want to like get into your orbit, read your book, listen to your podcast, what's the best way to kind of like find you?
So the best way to get in contact with me is Instagram. It's at Live Well Bipolar. Everything is there. That's the place you guys can find me, message me. Everything's in my bio, the book, the podcast, Apple Podcast, Spotify, wherever you listen, everything is all there. And I love connecting and just the messages and all of that. So yes.
Perfect. We will share that link in the show notes so people can access it very easily. And, you know, thank you for wanting to do this, first of all, and being willing to listen to me say random things that come to mind. I think it's so helpful for me. Like we said before, it's helping to heal this 8-year old that I'm carrying with me or walking with. So thank you for just being you and sharing yourself.
Of course, always happy to do so. And thank you for having me and doing the work that you're doing and making these conversations accessible and helping other people heal that 8-year old or whatever age self that they're still working on. So I loved our conversation, and I look forward to just many more.
Thank you so much. And if you are listening and you enjoy this conversation, or maybe there's someone in a situation like Paris describes that she was in, maybe you send this episode to them and say, hey, I thought of you. You might want to listen to this episode. That'd be great. As an indie podcaster, word of mouth is just so fantastic. So thank you for listening. And I will be back next week with a brand new episode. Thanks again, Paris.
Awesome. Yay.
For more information, please visit www.thelifeshiftpodcast.com.